Welcome, listeners, to this special episode of Nautilus, episode number 3, dedicated to the events of yesterday in the country where I reside, Hungary. Of course, we are talking here about the elections, the parliamentary elections that have taken place on 12th April 2026, which have led to the fall of the 16-year rule of Prime Minister Viktor Orban. Now, I have been living here for quite some while, actually, in fact, since 2010, with some episodes not being here. I'm here currently as well, and I've been able to observe events surrounding these elections and the precursors to these events. And many people have asked me to comment and to give my impressions of what has happened here. So I'll be doing myself a favor by not having to repeat myself and just recording this. Um, The first thing to say is that, of course, for many dissidents within Europe and within the West as a whole, the fall of the Orban government represents defeat. So does it for people that are listening from the Eurasian East and from the global South, who had counted on Hungary standing up to globalism, to the world empire, and to stand up for things like state sovereignty and true identity versus globalist dictatorship. So, in this sense, we are talking here about the fall of the last citadel, as we might call it, of Western civilization. That is, Western civilization to the west of the border between Eastern and Western Christianity. So Hungary, of course, is a country that is both Catholic and Protestant. Although officially the Catholics are in the majority, and the Catholic religion has shaped the power structure here in the sense of the monarchy. Protestantism is as well present, and in this sense, it was really an outpost of Christian civilization. It has been called such by Orban himself. So the fall of this government, it is not something that we should be easy about. It deserves some of our attention because the analysis of the circumstances will explain quite a lot about the larger predicament of which the struggle for power in Hungary is part. That is the struggle for power inside the West between globalist occupation regime that is in power throughout not only Western Europe, but now also all of Central Europe, and that is getting more and more militant in its international policies, not only domestically, but also internationally. So, what can we say about the true achievements of Orban during the 16 years that he was in power? What distinguished him from, let's say, the house and garden variety of globalism in the rest of the West? Well, he, of course, stood up against what I would call reverse colonization, but which, of course, is better known as mass immigration. So he imposed controls on immigration from outside of Europe. And um, he, of course, also stood up against wokeness. And that, of course, means sexual perversion and identity deconstruction in the largest sense. He stood for the conservation of certain cultural forms and of traditional identity. Another distinguishing feature of his rule was his attempt to maintain at least some geopolitical balance within the region. He refused to be drawn into a straight confrontation with Russia over the Ukraine, for example. And I think very importantly and quite misunderstood, he stood for peace. So Viktor Orban, he maintained that the most important item of his political agenda, as he proposed to the people now in this last election campaign, was to preserve the peace for Hungary. I think this last element is more important than most people think, but it definitely did not save him from being defeated, and defeated by a large margin. As it looks now, his opponents, the Tisza party, led by a man called Peter Magyar, has gained an outright majority in parliament. That means a two-thirds majority, which will enable him to deconstruct and change the fundamental laws and the fundamental protections that Viktor Orban provided to Hungary over his time in office. But I think that these achievements, and they are achievements, are also counterbalanced by certain things that he did not do. So he was 16 years in power, but what he did not do is as important as what he did do. He did not exit the EU, although he had quite a amount of trouble with the EU from both sides. He didn't like certain things that they wanted, and they certainly didn't like him, and they opposed him at every step of the road. He also did not exit NATO. To the contrary, he never even made that any item in his speeches and in his public statements. He also did not stand up against the sanctions imposed on Russia very unfairly over the Ukraine conflict. And he also did not really stop immigration. So he did stand up to mass immigration of the kind that we saw in Western Europe, but he did not stop immigration as such. The main difference between the immigration in Hungary and in the immigration in other Western countries was that he was emphasizing what we would call the Australian model. He did not let in people that just wanted to profit from social welfare and those kind of things and free housing. Rather, he let in people that he was thinking are contributing to the economy and contributing to Hungary's development. So he let in people that wanted to invest, people that had skills, people that could set up businesses, and people that could contribute to the national economy as he saw it. So that means that in Hungary, the immigration of a different kind and of different origins, there are many people here in Hungary from China, from Central Asia, from Turkey, and from other countries of Eurasia that came here without using the idea of, let's say, what is important in the West, asylum and family unification. These procedures he did not accept. It was always the individual that was decided on his qualities and his contribution to the country. And that was the basis of his immigration policies. But that does not mean that that immigration did not have a big impact on Hungary. It did. It also changed demographics, especially in Budapest, the capital. So, why was he voted out of office? Can be divided into 2 points. And the first is, of course, domestic opposition, and the second would be foreign interference. Let's deal with the first, because we should not underestimate the amount of opposition that Viktor Orban encountered within his own country, more than people think. I do believe that the decisive victory of his opponents have much to do with the defects of the Orban government in domestic politics. So the first argument that can be made against him is corruption. So the most important factor probably in his defeat is the perception, and not only the perception, but the proven corruption of his cronies. The Fidesz party is seen as a highly corrupt institution. That does not mean, of course, that his opponents will do any better. It is just the fact that the electorate wanted to punish Fidesz for this. The second, of course, it's the sell-out of the country. The sell-out of the country to what we would call big business and globalist banking. So this meant that in Hungary, Hungarian domestic production was not being protected. On the contrary, uh, hardly any clothing is produced still in Hungary. All industry has been eliminated, practically speaking, except for some uh, specific foreign investing enterprises. And even agricultural produce in the supermarkets is often replaced by foreign imports, which means that, ironically, a country like Hungary that is self-sufficient, used to be self-sufficient in terms of agricultural produce, is now importing fake low-quality food from countries like Holland. Then there has been part of this sell out of the country, the virtually unlimited uh, buying up of land and housing by foreign investors on a large scale and on a small scale, so privately as well as through firms. So a lot of the real estate in the countryside is sold to German and Dutch farmers and people that are involved in tourism. Then in the cities, a lot of the housing and the business premises, they are bought up by big firms, some of them Israeli, Chinese, but also many Ukrainians who came here after the war started, who invested money here. In fact, many people say that a large part of real estate in Hungary is in the hands of a foreign mafia, and this has caused pressure on housing prices for locals who cannot afford the rents, who cannot afford to buy, and who have to cope with very high prices. Then, of course, there has been the reduction of Hungary to what you would call, let's say, um, a low price manufacturing country. So wages have been artificially repressed, and this has led to what in German you would call Vereinlendung, so the impoverishment of the countryside as well as the uh, working classes. Wages are very low compared to the prices that have risen tremendously. Then also he has um, failed to reverse the privatization of the governments before him. So business is all private, and the state only is reduced to a small corner of the national economic life. This has caused tremendous price rises and a fall into poverty for large parts of the indigenous population. Of course, the sell out of the country is also visible in the sense that there has been demographic replacement. Um, foreign groups, foreign people have taken over large parts of the national economy. And this, of course, has also been resented by many people in Hungary. Then, of course, there is another third factor. So, except for the corruption and the sellout of the country, there is the perception of Orban as a servant of foreign forces, not EU forces, but of Trump specifically and of Netanyahu. So it should be noted that Orban was an ally of Trump and of Netanyahu to the extent even of inviting the Israeli foreign prime minister into the country in the middle of the Gaza genocide. Hungary was one of the very few countries that stood by Israel, even throughout all the events of the last 2 years. And I think, in terms of perception, his association, Orban's association with Trump and Netanyahu, has not done him well. In this sense, the visit of the Vice President Vance, who was sent here to visit Orban just before the elections, has probably had a counterproductive effect, something like a kiss of death in a certain sense. The association with America and Israel has not paid off for Orban. Now, the reason that he fell, I said, two reasons, of course. There's the domestic factor and there is the foreign factor. The foreign factor, of course, means interference. So interference by the EU has been visible from the very start of the Orban's rule. The EU has gone to the extent of blocking funds, EU funds, which amounted to like 10% of gross national product. So that's quite a lot for a small country like Hungary. Hungary has also gone under tremendous pressure in other ways in the media. It has been condemned for so-called human rights violations, for not pushing the woke agenda, for not accepting mass immigration, all these kind of things, which has painted Macron publicly in European perception as something of a fascist or even of a Nazi. This is an association that has been put on him by, I would call it, establishment narratives in the West from transnational institutions, not the EU and others. Of course, this pressure is had also another aspect, and that is the interference in the sense of financial bribery. So through NGOs and through EU funds, lots of money has come into the country, but also lots of money has come into the country in other ways, namely through physical transport of money from the Ukraine. Just to remind people that a few weeks before the elections took place, one time the Hungarian police made an action seizing money transport from the Ukraine with millions in cash and kilos of gold. Um, this money import probably was partially transit, partially to fund investment, so-called, in Hungary, but has also partially gone into the pockets of the political opposition. We should not forget that the party that is now coming to power, the TISA party, and its leader, Peter Magyar, are actually creations in the style of the French president Macron. People that come from nothing, ex nihilo, into the political landscape with large funds at their disposition, with much media attention given them, and with the complete apparatus of a political party sufficient to the extent of being able to dislodge the sitting government. I think bribery on a national level has been achieved by the EU to make possible this regime change, because that's what it really is. So if you bribe enough people, you can achieve a lot. Of course, there are three Bs. There is the bribe, there is the blackmail, and there is the bullet. All three probably have had some effect on the election result now. Let's not forget that Orban has been threatened literally, physically, has received physical threats from the Ukraine, even explicitly through President Zelensky of Ukraine, threatening him with dire consequences if he didn't change his tune. Now he is out. Foreign interference has succeeded, and not even a color revolution was necessary. A smooth transition through sufficient amount of bribery and pressure has been achieved. So if we look at the qualities of Orban, we can also judge him by the way he is leaving office right now. So let us imagine that what he considered his program, standing for the sovereign rights of the nation and standing for the identity of the nation, if he would really have taken them seriously, you can ask yourself the question, why did he not, for the 16 years, pull his country out of those transnationalist, globalist institutions like the EU, like NATO? Another question, why, if you really stand for these values of sovereignty and identity, why do you let a system continue, a political system continue in your own country that ensures a continuous danger to this sovereignty and to this identity? So the political system, the parliamentary democratical system, in the way it has been developing here, was kept in place by Orban and allowed his opposition finally to defeat him. He has not made sufficient changes to ensure sovereignty and identity to be protected in this sense. Of course, he says the electorate has decided, the people have spoken. But I think that this is an empty phrase used by many um, civic nationalist parties, such as his, which pretend to stand up for national rights and national interest, but in fact are quite weak and unwilling to take the consequence of this statement, this stance, to its logical conclusion. They are unwilling, if it comes to the real protection of the nation, to stand up for it. So it's of course true that the electorate has a role. But also does so does the government. The government also has a role in protecting the electorate from being cheated and to protect it against itself. This is certainly not the case in with Orban. Orban is just going to be pensioned now, probably taking with him a lot of prestige and money with him to his comfort zone that he is entering now. In this sense, he has been part of a system that is, as a whole, not conducive to uh, national sovereignty and national identity. And of course, this fits very well with his stated political orientation, which is liberal, classical liberal. That is what he is. And of course, liberalism is always characterized by individualism and looking out for your own interests, of course, mingled with all kinds of slogans of um, the free market and libertarian freedoms. In fact, liberal politics are never, in the final analysis, they are never compatible with national interests and uh, national identity. This has been proven throughout the West since the 1980s. And in fact, I like to remind people here of the words of my Belgian colleague, Robert Steukers, who always noted that the essence of liberalism is politicide. Politicide means the killing off of politics, the destroying of political mechanisms that control and that limit um, the economy as well as the social life as well as the culture. So politicide simply means that liberalism wants to remove all control mechanisms on the market forces and on social development and on cultural development. It assumes that the people can be left without any kind of action. And all the values of liberalism, including the freedoms of conscience and the freedoms of civic freedoms and civic rights, they are in this sense all conditional. They are conditional upon this vacuum at the top, a vacuum of power. Now, Orban, in this sense, has achieved in 16 years nothing but, we would call it, postponement of processes that have taken place in the rest of the West earlier. So, in fact, the mass immigration which took place and that he has not accepted in Hungary, but it happened in the West, and other processes such as the woke movement, which in Hungary was stopped by him, they will now flood the country. These processes will now probably accelerate to an extent of changing Hungary very quickly, quicker than even happened in the West. I like to remind people of the example of Ireland. Ireland, till the middle of the 2010s, used to be a country that was backward, so called, and did not have much mass immigration, was not very woke. But once the floodgates were opened, it went very extremely quick into this two process, to the extent that mass immigration and wokeness became stronger in Ireland than many other places. I think the same will happen here in Hungary. Hungary is going to be doing catching up on these processes. Of course, a certain amount of revenge taking by Brussels and other transnational institutions will be part of that. And Hungary will be made to eat humble pie for some time, including the obligatory worship of Zelensky and the dismantlement of everything that Orban has built. Let's not forget that Orban, during the years that he was in power, managed to restore his country back to something of dignity in many respects. So he eliminated criminality in the country, or at least he did many steps to at least eliminate dangers in the street on the physical level. And he also conducted a natalist policy. He encouraged people to have children and families by subsidizing housing and by giving tax break to young families. He also did much to destroy the mass prostitution that had come to Hungary in the wake of the fall of communism. I think all of these things are going to be reversed. We should not forget the new government, the TISA government under Peter Magyar, has probably a two-thirds majority, allowing them to roll back all the reforms made by Viktor Orban. So we are probably going to go back to mass prostitution, mass criminality, and anti-natalist policies, each time linked with an extra thought of uh, mass immigration and wokeness. Yes, so the prospect for Hungary is not very good. And we might ask ourselves, did people not appreciate what Viktor Orban did? As I said, there are many domestic reasons for the electorate to reject him. But I think that the demographic shift should not be underestimated as well. So it's not just politics; it is also the demographics that play a role here. People have gone to the cities, and of course, city life tends to make people liberal. Uh, Young people have tended to drift to the larger cities, um, away from the countryside. The countryside has been stripped of many of its facilities. Transport has decayed. Hospitals there have closed. Clinics have closed. Shops have closed, making life difficult for people in the countryside. Job opportunities are scarce there. So that's the urbanization. So um, urbanization also was urbanization, and this it's self-defeating for any kind of conservative government. If you want to preserve conservative values, you need to find a balance between city and countryside, and this has been lost in Hungary. Another demographic factor that plays a role is the shift in perception between generations. So the generation that voted in Orban originally, which had certain experiences, including experience of the very wild and very tragic years after the fall of communism, when Hungary became something of a Wild West, with certain parallels to Russia under Yeltsin, when people became very poor, when many people had to leave the country, when there was criminality and the country became unlivable for many people. This experience of this generation led them to vote in Viktor Orban. There were also very specific reasons, namely that the sitting liberal government before Orban was shown to be corrupt in very drastic ways, proven to despise his own people by leaked recordings. In any case, this experience, this cohort, this demographic cohort, is now filtering out of the electoral process. So this generation has become smaller, is retreating from the political scene, and the experience of young people is now coming to the fore and becoming important. Young people that have had the experience of life in Western Europe in many cases, who have imbibed Western values through um, English language literature, English language media, social media, through the internet, who feel themselves to be part and parcel of the wider Western system. They have become unrooted and alienated from what we would call traditional Hungary, what in French Charles Marat always called La Profonde France. We also have La Profonde or La Hongrie Profonde, so the deep Hungary. the deep Hungary of tradition, of history, of values, of identity. The young people, they are rooted from this. You can see this in the way they dress, in the way they speak, in the things that they aspire to, and in their cosmopolitan outlook. So I think the demographic shift, both from the countryside to the city, and from the older generation to the new generation, is having a quite dramatic effect also on the electoral result here. Well, so what will be happening in Hungary? As I said, I think there will be something of a race to overtake Europe, the Western Europe, even in the sense of the wokeness and the mass immigration. This shift in the government will also see a reorientation towards globalist values in geopolitics. And I think the last part actually is something that people tend to underestimate. So Viktor Orban said in his election campaign, vote for me because then you vote for peace. And I think people tend to underestimate that part because I do believe that Orban was one of the last elements hindering globalists in the sense of the EU and NATO from entering into a direct confrontation with Russia. So Hungary stood in the way of that. It was a break on the road to war. I think in this, Viktor Orban was right. The preservation of peace was the real issue in this election. And this is very sad to say because it means that Hungary has not only left the path of authentic identity and true state sovereignty, which Viktor Orban preserved to a certain extent, but it has also left the a path of peace. Of course, there is the saying that sometimes you have to become more sick in order to appreciate your health. But the question, of course, remains to be seen if this sickness will show to be survivable or not. From Hungary, I have given you this analysis and my take. The mood in the streets, it's something akin to a hangover. If you look at the people walking in the morning in the city, you can still find the leftovers of the party yesterday, but people are looking down and not up. They're staring to the floor and they are thinking. It is something like somebody has done something in the weekend. He has had a party, but when he thinks back on it, he is a little bit ashamed. But of course, it's too late now. The die has been cast. Hungary is signing off. That's all. I thank you for your attention. Goodbye.